central characteristics. Central motives are inward-looking, and maybe the common denominator among different kinds of arguments, conservative arguments, would be that the Japanese conservative people tend to regard the post-war records of Japanese diplomacy as having been exceedingly constrained by the history of war and having lacked enough assertiveness as a sovereign state. And I'm not saying if this is right or wrong as an assessment of a post-war reality of Japan, but clearly that's the assumption of the Japanese conservative ideologues. Japan has been exceedingly constrained by the history of war. Therefore, it tends to regard the history of the Japanese wars, particularly the ones since the 1930s, as not being quite unique and tend to equate them with the other wars in the world history. Again, I'm not judging whether it's right or wrong, but I'm just explaining their perception. And in that connection, they tend to believe the post-war constitution imposed by the winners of the war is the source of unjustifiable constraints on post-war Japanese diplomacy, and maintain that the revision of Article 9 is essential for Japan to engage in a sovereign state diplomacy. And so, the following 2 points have relevance for Japan's external policy. And these frustrations against the post-war premises of Japanese diplomacy are not necessarily accompanied by the articulation of any future-oriented strategy. But the fuels of their assertiveness come from their felt necessity to fight against the domestic opponents promoting liberal and progressive views of the history of war and post-war Japanese diplomacy. So the end result as far as Japan's foreign policy is precisely because of the lack of any coherent alternative strategy for the future. Japanese conservative political elites tend to have mixed views toward the function of the US-Japan alliance in Japanese diplomacy. As far as the ideology of political conservatism is concerned, particularly in relation to the history of war and the post-war constitution, the United States is the primary source of constraints on Japan's freedom of action. But the lack of any future-oriented strategy or alternative strategy for that matter makes it alternative inevitable to come back to the alliance with the United States in dealing with traditional security issues, including Japan's national defense. So those are main characteristics that I observe. Then that's why I gave the title, Politics of what? Memory or History? Memory politics in Japan. So to explain, to understand the domestic context in which these questions of history or memory tend to be highlighted is very critical as far as I'm concerned. And here I have to be short for the lack of time. But the two most fundamental premises of post-war Japanese diplomacy, it's a textbook kind of explanation, have been, and in my view, will continue to be the post-war constitution, particularly the Article 9, and the US-Japan alliance. And as you may be aware, not a single word of the post-war constitution, initially installed in 1945, has been changed up until today. And not a single word of the US-Japan alliance security treaty has been changed since it was revised in 1960. So these are really extraordinary history, I think, for any sovereign state. And there are reasons, of course, and the most fundamental reason being the history of aggressive wars. Because the post-war constitution is a product when the Allied wars were contemplating a post-war international order. And the Cold War had yet to begin. So the Japanese constitution was installed in the pre-Cold War era when the punishment of Japan was the central, of course, concept. And Korea was considered to, of course, become independent after a 5-year international internship, trusteeship, international trusteeship system. And China was, of course, at that time considered to be a center of Asia as a democratic country with Chiang Kai-shek Kuomintang party in power. And that's when China got the seat of the UN membership as a Permanent Security Council member. But all those preconditions are gone after 1947, 1949, and 1950. So Japan, exemplified or embodied by the concept of Article 9 of post-war constitution, has, at least in theory, had already become outdated when Japan got independence by signing the San Francisco Peace Treaty. So San Francisco Peace Treaty or San Francisco Peace Regime embodied two totally different components of international systems. One is pre-Cold War international order, so post-war order, and the other is Cold War realities. And Japan had peace constitution, product of pre-Cold War era, and the US-Japan alliance, the product of the Cold War. So those two would never have been institutionalized under the same period. Those are the products of entirely different international realities. But of course, the world has suffered from that dichotomy, and San Francisco Peace Regime had those characteristics, and Japan's post-war regime, deeply embedded in the San Francisco Peace Regime, also had that dichotomy. So the result of Japanese domestic politics, because Japan had those two as basic premises, was the division of Japanese nationalism. Japanese leftist, progressive nationalists who harbored the peace constitution as the Bible of Japan for post-war Japan, in effect lived in pre-Cold War world, in the post-war order. So they harbored peace constitution, but they didn't like the US-Japan alliance. They didn't like the Cold War. But those realists living under the reality of the Cold War accepted the US-Japan alliance, but they didn't like the peace constitution, product of pre-Cold War period. So that was a division of Japanese nationalism, but those two segments of nationalism continue to attack different parts of the Japanese post-war diplomatic premises. So that's the complication of domestic context in which Japanese political conservatism had some position. And those two premises having constrained Japan's freedom of action in a most fundamental way, both Article 9 and the US-Japan alliance. The rise of nationalistic challenges of a kind was a natural phenomenon, I think, maybe for any sovereign country. If Korea had those two, there should have been nationalistic challenges against those two premises in one way or another. So nationalistic challenges against those premises, I define them as a symptom of Japan's post-war domestic political structure. But here the fundamental mistake which many observers tend to make is taking a symptom for a possible solution to Japan's problems. But I'm 100% confident that they will fail in providing a solution. They will continue to turn out to be a symptom of Japan's domestic problem. Therefore, actually carrying out their agenda is not going to happen easily, including the revision of Article 9. But if that situation continues, maybe Japan will continue to have this similar kind of domestic confusion, and the end result being Japan will remain relevant rather than being a source of change. And here, the kind of emotional vicious cycles concerning history issues between Japan and Korea, Japan and China, are often the case, fuels to Japanese conservative arguments, rather than leading to a solution to the problem, or even leading to the lesser presence of Japanese conservatism. This is really ironical. So I think in order for us to go ahead from the current situation, the observation that I've just made, I think, should be much more debated among East Asian people and other people, rather than history issues per se, which of course is very important. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Professor Soya. What I heard was, again, rather optimistic, contrasting to the second speaker, What we have really is a sense that the Japanese conservatives, in bringing up the history issues, really do so for domestic reasons, have no particular international relations agenda. And if others just are quiet about that, let these statements go rather unnoticed, that will calm them, and that will mean that those issues really don't have much significance, that Japan really isn't changing that much because it's following the basic premises of the Yoshida Doctrine in its policy. And so this is a rather hopeful view if it's handled correctly, although there was some sense that maybe the U.S. is the real issue for Japan, and maybe the implications for Japan and U.S. ties are more negative than for Japan-South Korean ties, despite the fact that Japan will stick to the alliance, as we heard. Well, there's much here to be discussed, I'm sure, particularly from those interested in Japan-South Korean relations and what the implications may be for this approach. We turn now to the final presentation from our presenters, and that is Professor Yang Biao from Shanghai.
Thank you, Chair. Also, thanks to Peace Forum for inviting me here. I'm also quite impressed that they put historical issue as the first session. We used to talk about international relations or security without talking about history. But actually, history in East Asia is not humanity, but first of all, a political science. Yeah. In recent decades, there is an increasing tension in the relationships of East Asia countries. Nationalism has become popular in the region. No compromise has been reached for historical issues such as history textbook issues and Yasukuni Shrine issues. East Asia tends to be another Middle East in terms of clash of historical concepts. The main reason for this situation is that these countries hold different views towards historical events. And the disputation over historical memory in East Asia becomes another pattern of conflict and a kind of peace without security. The root of peace crisis in East Asia lies in its disunity, a fatal weak point of East Asia society. From the historical perspective of its modern development, this disunity is not a born characteristic, but a cultivated one. East Asia belonged to a culture circle of Confucianism. Under the influence of this common culture, close ties between nations were formed. Gradually, a unique form of civilization and a social system with China once as the center was established. However, in modern times, the integrated social structure nurtured by the common culture and the stable social system was damaged under the impact of Western civilization. The declination of China, the westernization of Japan, and the invasion of Western powers shattered the traditional system of East Asia, which further threatened its cultural integrity. The rise of Japan broke up the original structure of East Asia. Japanese invasions and colonization incurred strong objection and antipathy from its conquered neighbors. Consequently, the original spiritual and emotional bond in East Asia society broke up. After the World War II, with the Iron Curtain stretching into East Asia, a bamboo curtain was formed, which divided the East Asia society into groups. As a result, the integrated social structure formed in a long historical evolution was shattered into pieces. Therefore, in recent decades, while we are amazed by economic miracles of East Asia, we can observe its innate paradox, the paradox between integrity and disunity. Integrity here refers to the common value innate in the core history and the core tradition of East Asia society. The pushing power of Confucianism towards the modern development of East Asia shows that modern East Asia countries still share this intrinsic integrity and benefit a lot from common culture. However, in contemporary East Asia, this integrity cannot counterbalance the disunity. Disunity means the diversity or disparity in social structure, despite the common ground shared by East Asia countries. It also refers to the disparity in terms of concept and spirit, especially the confrontation of historical concept and the disparity of ideology. Integrity is the driving force of the mutual development of East Asia society, whereas disunity hinders East Asia from exercising its influence in worldwide scope. The smashing effect caused by the confrontation of historical concepts not only reveals the inherent weakness in East Asia, but also sets obstacles towards its future peace. Thus, certain core power as the driving force is a must for the combination of East Asia society. The integration of European community has set a good example in this regard. In my view, Chinese historical memory is featured by optimism. China has the characteristic that her history is likely to be romanticized. People from other countries would be confused by the glory that Chinese see in failures. Although China suffered a lot from spirits, defeats, and invasions from foreign powers, Chinese are still proud of their past as a big country, and this pride very often becomes a yardstick for them to measure the world history. In the very era when nationalism are widely popular day by day, it's truly through collective memories that Chinese structure their world and understand their past. Thus, memory of the history is romanticized and viewed with optimism. Conversely, in evident contrast with China, the memory of history in Japan is characterized by a strong realism and is greatly pessimistic. The realistic and indefinite nature of the war memory in Japan embraces the particular attribution concerning the history and ideology. It's necessary for us to get a better understanding of the Japanese memory of history in its social and historical contexts. The consciousness about the responsibility for the war of Japan is pegged directly to how they face up to the political incentives and economic demands of the future. These are caused by the changes within international relations as well as by campaigns for compensation from the region. On the other hand, the Chinese lends emotional reminiscence as the significant inner source in the memory of history. There is only the ideological essence the memory has to shield, rather than the complicated international political relationships with which Japan has to meet. China and Japan, two major East Asia countries with long nation history, both started to reconstruct themselves in shadow of Western from the 19th century. Nevertheless, China seemed an increasing feminized and inactive culture at a time when Japan was taking a sternly masculinizing pace. These two countries had different historical views in the process of self-transformation. To China, Asia was regarded as her mother continent, and China thus can undoubtedly follow the track of Eastern historical traces. However, as for Japan, in modern time, she was confronted with the confusion over whether she should separate herself from the rest of Asia when launching the process of movement onto Western tracks. Just like the issues concerning globalization, the conception of Asia is also hard to define. Asia is not only a political concept, but also a cultural one. At the same time, it is both geographic notion or a criterion of value judgment. In a quite long historical period, Asia is not just a geographic idea on a self-sufficient basis. It's often regarded as a vertical ideological image absolutely opposed against Europe. From the perspective of world history, China and Japan are closely bonded. While we are discussing how Japanese interpret history, it's necessary for Chinese to understand Japanese culture and society in a logical way. In modern times, Chinese paid special attention to Japan in that Chinese could understand the West through Japan and follow its suit. Nowadays, Chinese admire Western civilization as Japanese did in Meiji period, while neglecting Japanese culture. Nationalism is one of the reasons. In the times of diversities, East Asia countries should hold an open attitude towards other cultures so as to truly understand the other's historical memory. Thus, future peace can be foreseen. And I would like to add something which is not on paper. And I think the main point, one of the main points which historical issue is so confused in East Asia is because almost all East Asia major countries, such as Japan, Korea, and China, history are state narrative. State narrative. And now it's a little bit changed to academic narrative or scholar narrative. And my viewpoint is maybe in future, if we can transform such history as state narrative into citizen narrative or individual narrative, the historical conflicts could be resolved in East Asia. As I can see in our classrooms in China, in Korea, yeah, I will finish, or in Japan, you will see very, very few students are using their left hands. Almost everyone uses right hands. But as I observed in Western classrooms, maybe 1/3 or even half of students are using their left hands. But I think that's not a genetic problem. East Asia children should also have the same proportion of left hands. It's not a genetic problem, it's a culture problem. Because in our culture, you are supposed to do what else is doing. That means you have to tell the history what else is telling. So I have a dream. In future, if one day we can see all East Asia children are free to use his or her left hands, the historical issue in East Asia will be solved. Thank you.
Thank you. What we heard is the most optimistic presentation, although the reasons for optimism seem a little unusual. Now, one, I think, basic reason for optimism, however, was the idea that China's rise is a uniting factor, bringing back a traditional regional unity, which Confucianism positively produced historically, and now China is likely to re-establish. Japan's influence has been negative, and China will overcome that. We didn't hear much in the presentation about the impact of the West on East Asia, although in his paper, Professor Yang was more critical of that impact and seemingly regarding universal values as not contributing to the regional unity that can be inspired by China's reemergence. I'm glad that we had this presentation because I think it brings out ideas that are becoming increasingly common in China and ideas that need to be discussed if we want to achieve some better understanding of the challenges that face us. Now we turn to our first discussant, and that will be Mr. Choi Won-do of the History Foundation, Northeast Asia History Foundation.
Thank you very much. It's my great honor to play the role of discussant in front of all these renowned scholars and audiences. Well, because Professor Rosman wants us to be very short, I'll discuss about the two papers presented by Professor Baker and by Professor Soya. So the first one is about Professor Baker's argument. Professor Baker is suggesting us two very sharp knives for the operation of this East Asian history problems. It's called, we have to separate intent and consequences. And then, according to his argument, if we can separate intent and consequences, then there is not much problem at reaching the conclusion and reconciliation about historic interpretations. Well, that's very optimistic to me. But in some sense, I feel like I'm standing on the island because as far as I know, history is based upon two facts. The first one is the continuation from the past to the present. And the second one is that the history is interpreted based upon the current political problems. In that sense, it is very hard to imagine how easy it would be to wield two knives of intent and consequences. So, as an example, the Professor Baker says that about the question of Goguryeo. He said, Koreans can accept the culture and populations inherited from the past, and China just to recognize the influence of those culture and population from the past. Well, it seems to be very simple, but the question is here, if everyone says, okay, this is our inheritance from the past populations, then China would have a problem. China have 52 minority tribes in its land, and along its boundaries there are several minority tribes also which sharing the identities. Then I wonder whether China would accept that, all those, the countries who is sharing the identities and inheritance, as they recognize, then whether the China would accept it or not. Well, then we have to think about how difficult it is to separate intent and consequences. Okay, then let me move to the second question, second paper, the Professor Soya's. Well, according to my reading of his paper, it seems that he is arguing Japanese political conservatives, who is the source of the historical revisionism, is nothing more than just an expression of frustration from the structure given after the end of the war. In that sense, it seems to be that he is very friendly to Koreans and seems to be very progressive. But on the other hand, after reading that, I wondered if he might be the real ultra-conservatives who says that the Japanese conservatives should be more stronger than that. So, well, yeah, so, well, when you think about his argument, he says that the political conservatives are just minimized then actually that may be the hope for all of us. But the problem is that in reality, the political conservatives are backed and supported by the real political forces. Some famous Japanese prime ministers can be categorized in these political conservative groups. And as Professor Yang Biao argues in his paper, Japan still has the question of emperor system, which is inherited from the past over the war. And then, well, my question is that, would that be fair to say that the Japanese political conservatives are just an expression of frustrations about that, and then they are occurring just some confusions in the process of decision making? Well, as far as I know, the Professor Soya wanted to talk about the solution in his paper, but his presentation was cut because of the time limit. Let me introduce some argument he proposed. He says that because Japan is not the four great powers in East Asia, it is just a middle power. As far as I know, he has been arguing that one in other papers. Japan is middle power, and then it cannot join the four great power groups. And then, in the near future, Japan and Korea can reach the real partnership. Then, we can move forward the future, which sounds very, optimistic and very attractive. But if you think that Japan is simply a middle power, then what is your position about Japan's quest for the permanent membership in the UN Security Council? As far as I know, the UN Security Council membership should have the will and capability to lead the world and solve the problems in the whole world. And then recently, there was a discussion about the trilateral conference among the United States, Japan, and China. A few days ago, it was rejected because of some opposition from the Chinese side. But anyway, many scholars and others accept that the three countries are the leading powers in this Northeast Asia region. Then if you let us know your position on these questions, then we can have better understanding of your idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. What we just heard, of course, was a challenge to some of the optimistic remarks from two of our presenters, suggesting that if we take into account political leadership, we find in the Chinese case hesitancy to allow groups to explore their historical